Until they bring the streetcars back, chapter 27. When I didn't eat much supper, my mother asked if I was feeling all right, and I was so jumpy on the phone with Lola I could hardly talk. We yacked about stuff that seemed kind of silly compared to what I was planning, and when I hung up, I said good night to my parents and went to my room as usual while they waited for Cedric Adams and the evening news. I'd give old Cedric some news that sprout hair on his teeth. I waited about 10 minutes and then sneaked out the back door, leaving my blankets looking like I was in bed and a stack of Sinatra playing softly. I had to get into the tree before Letterman came out. After running the 6 blocks, I climbed into the oak at 9:50 and I couldn't catch my breath. Gretchen's room was dark, and I jacked myself up by telling myself she wouldn't be sleeping there tomorrow, and that Creep would never lay another finger on her as long as he lived. Then the squeaking door told me Letterman was there, in the dark, a shadow. He stood there like he was listening for something, and I thought sure he'd hear my heart pounding. Then he hiked out through the alley and headed south on Howell like always. I caught my breath and slid out of the tree and sneaked over to the enclosed porch. When I slowly opened the store door, the spring started screeching, and I held it like I was strangling a snake, cringing there on Gretchen's back step. I tried the knob on the inner door, almost hoping that it wouldn't be locked. It wasn't. I slid in. It would be locked, sorry. I slid in, eased the storm door closed, and criminy, it sounded like the opening of the inner sanctum. There was the usual junk in a cheap chest-type freezer. I listened for a minute and let my eyes get used to the darkness. Bony fingers of light from the neighborhood poked in the windows, and there wasn't a sound from the house. I crept to the Kelvinator and swung open the door. A dim light came on, and packages of food looked as normal as pie. With my heart hammering, I dug through the frozen food towards the bottom. There wasn't much room to shove packages around in the freezer, and one slid off and hit the floor like a brick. I was bending over the freezer, and I didn't move a muscle, straining every cell in my body to hear. Nothing. Cripes, I started to panic, and I dug like crazy for the bottom until I found a wrapped bundle I figured was it. What I prayed I'd never find. I pulled it to the top and saw it was stamped roast beef. My hands were numb, and I fumbled to unwrap it, to be sure. I couldn't bring Sergeant Riley a beef or roast or leg of lamb. I peeled back 2 layers of wax paper until in the frosty light little Jacob stared up at me like he was still gasping for air. His frantic, drowning face shocked me, and I hit my head on the freezer lid. All of a sudden, I couldn't breathe, and I was gasping for air like I was drowning. I had to get out of there. I rewrapped the package and grabbed it and closed the freezer, and the sound behind me from the house didn't register until I had my hand on the knob of the storm door. I glanced back and saw Letterman looming out of the inner doorway with the butcher knife in his hand. I almost tore the storm door off of its hinges, blasting out of the porch. I plowed through the snow, headed for the street, and I heard the storm door bang again behind me, with the baby under my arm. I bombed out on Goodrich and almost went down on the ice. I glanced back and saw him coming between the houses, and just, geez, the sky was really flying. I took the middle of the street, ripping past streetlights and sleeping families, and I started shouting bloody murder. Hey, help, help, somebody, call the police. But I couldn't keep it up. I didn't have enough breath. When I was almost to the corner, a car showed up at Fairview. Hey, stop, help, I shouted. But its side windows were all frosted over and it went sailing by. I looked up and down Fairview as I crossed, but that was the only car in sight. I was losing my mind, and I ran into Tangletown when the streets curved and circled all over the place. In the silent cold, I heard his crunching footsteps behind me like the runner, but that wasn't some prank. If I didn't outrun him, it would be in trouble for my father. I was running for my life, and I didn't run fast enough. My blood would be smeared all over Goodrich or Amherst. I could feel the blade diving into my back any second, and I was ripping as fast as I could. The frozen baby was getting heavy, like a stone out of Helga's belly. I switched arms holding it. I kept praying that the car would come along, maybe even a cop car, because basically Letterman was gaining on me. At the five-cornered intersection with Cambridge and Princeton, I cut to the right downtown, down Princeton, almost falling on a patch of ice. My chest ached and I couldn't breathe, and I had a fist of pain in my right side, but he was relentless, step for step behind me, and I couldn't shake him, and it made me mad. I'd run the basketball court for months. I was in great shape, but I'd never run for my life before. An older guy with a butcher knife was catching up. I thought of cutting through yards the way I ditched the runner, but I might fall in the snow or be trapped by a fence in the neighborhood. I didn't know, so I stayed out of the icy streets. By the time I knocked and someone came to the door, they'd find my body with a carving knife stuck between the shoulder blades. I don't know why, but I started thinking of kinds of crazy stuff like what Lola was doing right then and what if Uncle Emil could be here now and take his axe to Letterman. Then I heard the streetcar over on St. Clair, a little more than a block away. I wondered if I could make it that far. Letterman was only a few yards behind me, puffing, his feet pounding on packed snow and ice. The sounds of the streetcar came closer, and I figured he hadn't crossed Wheeler yet. I was afraid my legs were going to buckle under me and then something grazed my back. I yelled and lunged away, and the frozen package slipped from my arms and slid across the icy street beside me like a curling stone, and I couldn't stop for a second to pick it up. The streetcar headed downtown, crossing in front of me from right to left. Luckily, the motorman was holding back so he didn't outrun his schedule in the lazy night hours when there was hardly any riders. I ran with everything I had left, and I knew if I didn't make it, I was dead. When I pulled even with her, stride for stride, I leapt onto the cowcatcher. I looked back and saw the manic stooped and stumbled under the streetlight, gasping for air. In one arm he held the frozen bundle, in the other he held the butcher knife. The St. Clair streetcar saved me. When the motorman stopped for the traffic light at Snelling, I climbed off the cowcatcher and beat it out of there. I didn't want to be tagged for some stupid prank when minutes before I had escaped being murdered by a lunatic. A block away, I slowed into a fast walk, but my heart and head were still going full throttle. Son of a gun, I'd blown it. I dropped little Jacob and lost the evidence that could have set Gretchen free. I fumbled the ball again. Letterman would get rid of the baby now, and I hated to think of what might happen to Gretchen. Riley was waiting, and I had nothing to bring him but fish stories. If I told him what had happened, that Letterman chased me with the butter knife and I saw the frozen baby, would that be enough to put him in jail? But if it wasn't, even though the police went and asked Letterman a bunch of questions, he'd still be able to get Gretchen. I had to protect her no matter what. I was the only one she had. For the life of me, I couldn't figure how Letterman had circled back and ambushed me at the freezer. Could he have spotted me in the tree and set a trap? Just the thought of it made it hard to breathe and made me sweat. On gimpy legs, I stumbled up the back steps like I'd been on a train wreck or something. When I was safe in my room, I felt weak and sick to my stomach. After undressing, I climbed under the covers, but the chills rattled my bones, and even with an extra blanket, I was still cold, my teeth chattering. And I couldn't believe what happened. Criminy, I must have been nuts to try it. I couldn't get to sleep in my mind. I was still running from Letterman. Had he recognized me as the kid he saw behind the bakery? Would he think Grinch had had anything to do with it? I couldn't quit worrying about her, and I got up twice to call the cops and tell them to go roaring up to her house and save her. I could never stop at the bakery again to help her through the day or go near the house until her father was put away. I felt like I was coming down with the flu, and it made me wonder if I was able to go through with my plan. Something I should have stuck to in the first place and forgot about that half baked stunt that almost got me killed. One day when Uncle Emil and I were hiking through the woods, we found a dead great horned owl. Its wings spread, the ground around it was beaten and thrashed in a wide circle, riddled with porcupine quills. It was rotting, and maggots crawled all over it. Uncle Emil kneeled and counted the quills sticking in its head and wings and body. There are 43. I remember how sad I felt for the owl. My uncle looked at the huge bird for a minute. Bit off more than he could chew, he said. Then he pulled out a large tail feather. He handed it to me. We kept hiking through the pines. I still had the feather stuck in the mirror over my dresser. I could hear Uncle Emil warning me. You've bit off more than you can chew. One thing I knew for sure, I could never let Letterman catch a glimpse of me, find out who I was, or I'd be worse off than the owl. Could he make Gretchen tell who I was? Would she? I was probably the only one outside of his family who'd seen the baby, and that meant now he'd be after me. Around 5, I fell asleep praying that Gretchen would be all right.